everybody, Rachel here. Today I'm going to talk about malaria because it's one of the biggest public health issues facing the world today, but you probably don't know anyone who's had it. Malaria is such a big topic that I'm going to be splitting this one into two videos. Malaria has been affecting humanity almost as long as we've been human. Genetic studies have found that Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that is responsible for most of the malarial infections in the world today, has been around for 50,000 to 100,000 years. But the population size of the parasite jumped around 10,000 years ago, when humanity first developed agriculture and began settling down. And basically, as soon as we started writing about malaria. Hippocrates described the unique periodic fevers of malaria. It was written about in China in the 1st century CE, and it was so common in ancient Rome that it was known as the Roman fever. One Roman, Columella, already associated it with the insects found in swamps, but in medieval times we rather lost the plot a bit. At that point, they thought it was caused by the bad air coming from swamps and marshlands, hence the name malaria. Malaria was once common throughout most of Europe and North America. In fact, it was once found on every continent except Antarctica. But now it is mostly confined to the tropical and subtropical regions in a broad band around the equator. Malaria is a zoogenic disease, meaning that it's caused by a pathogen that is spread between animals and humans. And it's also a vector-borne disease, meaning that we get it from being bitten by an animal, in this case a mosquito. The pathogen that causes malaria is one of several species of Plasmodium, a type of protozoa. Who remembers middle school biology? A protozoa is a single-celled eukaryote, and a eukaryote is an organism that has a nucleus in its cell or cells. Humans are also eukaryotes. Plasmodium is an obligate parasite, so it always needs another organism to supply its nutrients for it. It can't live on its own. The life cycle of a parasite that causes a vector-borne illness is complicated. There's always a primary host in which the parasite matures and reproduces sexually, and also a secondary or intermediate host, which harbors the immature parasite and is required by the parasite to undergo its development and complete its life cycle. For Plasmodium and malaria, we are the secondary host, and the primary host is the female Anopheles mosquito. When a mosquito bites a human, it transmits a form of Plasmodium, called a sporozoite, in its saliva into the human's blood vessel. The sporozoites can move, and they travel through the blood vessels to the liver, where they reproduce asexually and produce thousands of a new form of the Plasmodium called a merozoite. These infect new red blood cells, undergoing a series of asexual multiplication cycles, at which point the cells burst and the merozoites go on to infect other cells. Some of the merozoites develop into gametocytes, effectively egg and sperm cells, which are taken up with the blood when another mosquito bites the human. The gametocytes develop in the mosquito's gut and then fuse into ooconites, which then develop into sporozoites, which travel to the mosquito's salivary glands, starting the cycle all over again when the mosquito bites another human. There are 5 species of Plasmodium that cause malaria in humans: P. falciparum, P. vivax, P. ovale, P. malariae, and P. knowlesi. P. falciparum is by far the most common and the most deadly. P. knowlesi isn't very common at all. It's a zoonotic species that usually causes disease in macaques, but also crosses over into humans. All of these species that infect humans can also infect other primates, and other Plasmodium species infect other mammals, birds, and even reptiles. And as I said before, it's the Anopheles mosquito that is causing all this trouble. But there are over 400 species of Anopheles mosquito, with about 30 of them being major malaria vectors. They all bite between dusk and dawn and lay their eggs in water where their larvae grow. It's just the female mosquitoes that bite animals and humans. They need a blood meal to nurture their eggs. Transmission of the Plasmodium parasite is more intense in areas where the mosquito species have a longer lifespan, so that the parasite has a longer time to develop inside the mosquito. And it's also more intense in places where the mosquito species prefer to bite humans instead of other animals. The mosquito species in sub-Saharan Africa have a long lifespan and a strong human preference, so that partly explains why malaria is so common in that area. Malaria has a 10 to 15 day incubation period. That's the time after the mosquito bites you, but before you begin to feel sick. And that corresponds to the time it takes the sporozoites to travel to the liver and for the merozoites to begin to be produced. Then you start to feel your first symptoms, and they are fever, headache, and chills. These may be mild, and you might have noticed that they're pretty common in other diseases too, so you might not figure out that you have malaria right away. There are other possible symptoms, such as joint pain, vomiting, hemolytic anemia, jaundice, hemoglobin in the urine, retinal damage, and convulsions. But the classic symptom is paroxysm. Paroxysm is when you have chills and shivering, and then fever and sweating in cycles. You might have heard of malaria being called tertian fever, and that's because the paroxysms occur every 2 days when malaria is caused by P. vivax or P. ovale. Quartian fever is every 3 days, and that's when it's caused by P. malariae. And P. falciparum causes recurrent fevers every 36 to 48 hours, or a milder but almost continuous fever. But if malaria that's caused by P. falciparum isn't treated within 24 hours, at 9 to 30 days after infection, it can progress to severe malaria, which can cause severe anemia, respiratory distress, cerebral malaria, where the Plasmodium crosses the blood-brain barrier and causes neurological symptoms, multi-organ failure, and death. Severe malaria can progress extremely quickly and cause death in a matter of hours. In the most severe cases of malaria, fatality rates can reach 20%, even with intensive care and treatment. Of the people with severe malaria, 25% of adults and 40% of children experience respiratory distress, with about 29% of it developing into acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. Contracting malaria while pregnant can lead to stillbirths, infant mortality, miscarriage, and low birth weight. And co-infections of HIV and malaria cause an increase in mortality due to malaria. And it can cause long-lasting effects. Cerebral malaria is one of the leading causes of neurological disability among children in Africa. And even if you don't get severe malaria, if it's not treated completely, your symptoms can go away and then come back. Sometimes that's because the parasites survive in the blood due to inadequate treatment. That's called recrudescence. And sometimes it's because the parasites have been eliminated from the blood, but they survive in the liver. That's called relapse. So malaria is a huge problem, and it has been for thousands of years. It was extremely prevalent in ancient Egypt and affected many of the people who worked on the pyramids. A particularly deadly epidemic of malaria in the 5th century CE may have contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. And if you've ever read any histories of the wars of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries CE, you'll have come across mentions of camp fevers. Many of those were malaria. Even in World War II, 60,000 American soldiers died from malaria, and 500,000 U.S. troops in the South Pacific contracted the disease. What is now known as the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, was actually founded in World War II as the Malaria Control and War Areas Agency to try to control malaria around the military training bases in the American South. In 2018, there were an estimated 228 million cases of malaria worldwide, with about 405,000 people dying from it. 67% of those who died were children under the age of 5. Most of those people were in Africa. 93% of cases and 94% of deaths occurred in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, maternal malaria was associated with about 200,000 infant deaths per year. But about half of the world's population is at risk of contracting malaria. In addition to sub-Saharan Africa, it's still endemic to parts of Southeast Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Western Pacific, and the Americas. And epidemics can happen anytime climate or other conditions change. In order for malaria to be endemic to an area, you need a high human population density, a high Anopheles mosquito population density, many places with stagnant water where the mosquito larvae develop, and high rates of transmission from mosquitoes to humans and from humans to mosquitoes. So if the climate changes so that we have more places where mosquito populations can grow, first we'll have epidemics, and then malaria will be endemic to more parts of the world. That would be bad for human reasons, of course, but also for economic reasons. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, malaria was a major factor in the slow economic development of the American South. It is currently commonly associated with poverty, and it also has a huge negative effect on the economic development of the areas where it is endemic. The factors that go into that are a high healthcare cost, working days lost due to sickness, days of education lost due to sickness, decreased productivity due to brain damage from cerebral malaria, and loss of investment and tourism. In some countries, malaria is responsible for 50% of hospital admissions, 50% of outpatient visits, and 40% of all public health spending. That all sounds pretty horrible, doesn't it? Even so, we do have some cause for hope, but you'll have to come back next week to find out what that is. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and you think you'll be interested in more videos about public health, click like and subscribe. Thank you. I hope to see you soon.